Though many Greek gods have remained popular over time as ancient mythological figures, few have maintained such an active presence as Hermes, or Mercury as the Romans knew him. First attested in Mycenaean Linear B script dating to 1300 BC, he became equated with several other gods over the period of Greek expansion, such as the Egyptian god Thoth, giving rise to Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice-born. In Gaul, Britain, and Germany, Hermes was one of the most honored gods, whereas in Greece, he had only 3 temples dedicated specifically to him. In Gaul, he had more than any other god. The Arverni hired the best Greek sculptor of the day, Zenodorus, to build a colossal statue of the god, which may have stood on the Piu de Dome, taking 10 years to build and costing 40 million sesterti. A soldier's pay at that time was only 900 sesterti a year. But did this Gaulish and Germanic Hermes really have anything to do with Greek Hermes, who stole the cattle of Apollo, who served as a guide to travelers, as a herdsman on the hilltops, as a thief in the night? What is the origin and nature of this god, and the meaning of some of his most important Greek myths? Who is this Lord of heralds, herds, and contests? Who is Hermes? Mount Kyllene, one of the most frequently mentioned sites held sacred to the god. It was here that the Homeric hymn places the birth of Hermes, in a cave on the second tallest mountain in the Peloponnese, in the rugged region of Arcadia, a region named for the bear. Kyllene was likely a haunt for wild animals like bears and wolves, whose howls would echo off the mountain ridges. Upon the mountain a temple was dedicated to the god, which according to legend was one of the first temples ever built in Greece, dedicated by Lycaon, a legendary founder of Arcadia. His name is derived from Lykos, wolf. A story relates how he was transformed into a wolf by Zeus for trying to feed him human flesh. Yet despite his infamous deeds, Lycaon was also remembered as the founder of the state, the great progenitor of the Arcadians, whose 50 sons were the names of their towns and villages, and the man who created one of the oldest competitive athletic competitions in Greece. Though it is claimed that Lycaon was a Pelasgian, referring perhaps to the pre-Greek population, his name is of purely Indo-European origin, as are the werewolf myths that surround him. To later Greeks, anything that seemed unusual about religious or cultural practices was known as Pelasgian, but at least some of those things, like the prophetic oak tree of Dodona, were things with the strongest European connections. It was in Arcadia where Hermes and his son Pan had their strongest followings, though sites in Boeotia and elsewhere also claimed his birthplace. Hermes was sometimes referred to as being of Kyllene, and the mountain's name may be derived from a word meaning bent or crooked from Proto-Indo-European skelo, which also forms an epithet for Hephaestus, Kilopodion, the limp foot, cognate perhaps with the Irish Cualann, the name of the legendary smith, and a mountain in Ulster. Throughout all Greece, Hermes was worshipped as a god, but it was only in Arcadia that he is known to have had specific temples constructed to him. This can be misleading, however, for he was worshipped nearly everywhere but temples, in groves, fields, mountains, within the home, and of course upon the road, where his stone markers served as shrines, and even in the temples of goddesses like Athena or Demeter, where sometimes ancient figures of Hermes stood. Stone Hermi were also placed in front of some temples and the doors to homes, or even as markers for graves. Hermes was absolutely ubiquitous in everyday life, and features third in quantity of artistic depictions, only slightly behind Heracles and Athena. He is also the ancestor of some of the most famous Greek heroes, great-grandfather of Odysseus and Jason, leader of the Argonauts. both wide travelers of ancient Greek myth, through his son Autolycus, the most famous and successful cattle rustler, whose name means the wolf itself. He was a bane to Sisyphus, the tyrant of Corinth, and a friend to Heracles, teaching him how to wrestle, while also getting him into a bit of trouble. There is much that is not understood about Hermes, though the topic is nearly as vast as the totality of Greek myth. We will, by the end, have undergone an odyssey that will reveal the nature of the god and his origins. But as with any journey, it is best to start at the beginning. The recorded tale of Hermes begins with the Mycenaeans. Sometime before 1600 BC, Indo-European Proto-Greek speakers pushed south into the region of modern-day Greece. They would have had similar religious beliefs to other nearby groups originating from the Indo-European milieu. They gained dominance across much of the mainland, and eventually the Cycladic Islands and Crete. Along with the shift of elites came a change of language and culture. Though certain vocabulary and cultural practices were absorbed over time, they retained key structures of their languages and religious beliefs. Most noticeably, this included the god Zeus, who is cognate with a name or a word for God shared across many Indo-European cultures. Yet the Linear B tablets from Pylos and Mycenae show that Hermes, under that name, was being sacrificed to as early as 1300 BC. A cataclysmic period fell upon Greece and the entire Mediterranean about 1200 BC. Within 50 years, the Mycenaean civilization had effectively collapsed. Its major cities stood as ghostly reminders of a glorious past, and memories of those ancient days lingered on. Many of the same gods continued to be worshipped, but the status and myth of those gods may have changed between 1300 and 750 BC when the Iliad is recorded. During that chaotic time, the less affluent Mycenaean Greeks may have retreated to the wilds in Arcadia, while others migrated to Cyprus, as these locations are where the direct descendant of the Mycenaean dialect of Greek continued to evolve. The region of Arcadia derives its name from the Proto-Indo-European for bear, denoting the rugged mountainous region likely inhabited by the creatures in ancient times. It was from myths of this region which the Greeks named the Big and Little Dipper, after Callisto and her son Arcas, who were transformed into bears and put into the sky. Arcas was an important founding figure who gave his name to the region, and Hermes is shown caring for Arcas, and some myths say he was brought up by Hermes' mother Maia. Many of the Pleiades sisters play an important founding role in the mythical origins of Arcadia and the Peloponnese generally. To form an understanding of who Hermes is, we will first look at his associations related through the genealogies. His grandmother, the mother of the Pleiades, is Plenia, thought to mean plenty, referring perhaps to the bounty of stars she gave birth to, for she not only is the mother of the Pleiades, but of the nearby cluster, the Hyades. Plenia is sometimes known as Aethra, meaning clear sky. Hyades means rainy ones, and are nymphs of the rains and the wet season. They, along with the Pleiades, were said to weep for their slain brother Hyad, or for the strain of their father's burden. Their tears were rain. The Pleiades have been used for navigations, but they also had associations with agriculture in relation to seasonal patterns. They rise before the sun in May, marking the calm sailing season and the summer. But they are also connected with rains and storms when they set at dawn in late October. Hesiod said, "But when the house carrier climbs up the plants from the earth to escape the Pleiades, then it is no longer the season for digging vineyards." This suggests that when the Pleiades have risen with the sun, it brings dryness, which the snail escapes by climbing upon the plants. Yet he likewise links them to storms, saying, "But should the desire for uncomfortable seafaring seize you, when the Pleiades plunge into the misty sea to escape Orion's rude strength, then truly gales of all kinds rage." The importance of these star clusters in marking seasonal activity and weather cannot be overstated. Connected to this seasonality is the month of Hermes, which is marked in many ancient Greek calendars, often sometime between October and February, perhaps aligning his month with the nighttime rise of the Pleiades and the wet season, which was more prosperous for crops and pastures. The Pleiades was one of the most important star groups for ancient Indo-Europeans, being featured on the Nebra sky disk dating approximately to 1600 BC, which shows the sun and moon traveling on a boat through the sky with the Pleiades above them, similar to depictions in Roman art over 1600 years later. The name Pleiades comes from Indo-European plou, meaning to fly, float, or run, the origins of English flow. Pleo in Greek means to sail, and this etymology seems to match their depiction in Bronze Age Europe. Hesiod, in Works and Days, cites the setting of the Pleiades at dawn as marking the bad season for sailing. In the Odyssey, Homer says that Odysseus never closed his eyes, but kept them fixed on the Pleiades, on late-setting Butes, and on the Bear, which men also call the Wain, and which turns round and round where it is, facing Orion, and alone never dipping into the stream of Okeanos. For navigation, then, the stars were most important, likely why some considered Hermes the founder of astronomy. Yet Hermes is also connected with his grandfather, Atlas, and is sometimes called Atlantiades. Roman Valerius Flaccus said of an artistic depiction, "There iron Atlas stands in Okeanos, the waves swelling and breaking on his knees. But the god himself, Helios the sun, on high hurries his shining steeds across the old man's body. Behind, with smaller wheels, follow his sister, and the crowded Pleiades, and the fires whose tresses are wet with dripping rain." This depicts Atlas as a road upon which the sun and moon travel. Homer says of him in the Odyssey, "Atlas of baneful mind, who knows the depths of every sea, and himself holds the tall pillars which keep heaven and earth apart." In the Theogony of Hesiod, Atlas is the son of Iaptos, who represents the pillar in the west. His name means the piercer, and associated with mortality, being the ancestor of all humans according to some myths, and the father of Prometheus. The west signifies the sunset, the onset of night, and death. In the Iliad, both Iaptos and Kronos were said to be cast down into Tartarus by Zeus. Yet though the tale of Hesiod associates the four other Titan brothers with different quarters, it is Atlas who is consistently shown to be the one to hold heaven and earth apart. Prometheus, meaning forethought, Epimetheus, afterthought or instinct, Menoetios, doomed might, and Atlas, enduring, all seem to represent particular aspects of consciousness. Prometheus is presented in some genealogies as being the foremost ancestor of the Greeks. His brother Epimetheus accepts and weds the first woman. Their mother was Clemena, which means fame, but specifically relating to fame after death. She also slept with Zeus, giving birth to memory. But that these progenitors of man are likewise Titans cast down into Tartarus isn't so far from Julius Caesar's comments relating to the Gauls believing that they were the descendants of Dis Pater, an underworld god. This will be examined in detail in a future video, but it is perhaps interesting to keep in mind when considering the nature of Hermes. But the takeaway for this video is that Hermes' ancestry is closely linked to kingly lines and indeed the origins of humanity. Atlas is in many ways the same as the world tree, which supports and connects together the cosmos. His name derives from Proto-Indo-European tele, referring to bearing or enduring, and also related to the ground or earth. He is thought to have become a mountain, but few were in agreement as to exactly which one. And in the earliest form, before taking on anthropomorphic guise, Atlas was almost certainly the sacred mountain itself that sustains earth and heaven upon it, akin to Olympus, Mount Meru, the Persian Harabarazaiti, which the sun, moon, and stars revolve around. In some local myths, Hermes was born upon the summit of Mount Olympus. In Tanagra, it was believed that Hermes was born on Mount Kerykeios, also the burial site of Orion. Nearby was a site called Polos, meaning pole or center, where Atlas was said to have sat and meditated upon the nature of heaven and the underworld. Mount Kyllena is also identified as being the house of Atlas. Atlas is usually represented as being on the very outer edge of the earth, standing just before dark night at the boundary of existence. Hesiod says, "And Atlas through hard constraint upholds the wide heaven with unwavering head and arms, standing at the borders of the earth, before the clear-voiced Hesperides." Like Hermes, represented by the pillar stone, Atlas is the pillar. In Prometheus Bound, Prometheus says, "I am distressed by the fate of my brother Atlas, who, towards the west, stands bearing on his shoulders the pillar of heaven and earth, a burden not easy for his arms to grasp." The Hyades and Pleiades are sometimes known as the Golden Gates of the ecliptic. That's because the pathway of the sun and moon passes directly between them. Atlas, at least in the Roman period, was a figure standing in the west, arching over the heavens upon his back, with the sun and moon driving over him. It is possible that he is the father of these two star groups because they were the most visible symbol of the ecliptic, the road of the sun and moon and wandering stars, the back of Atlas. Hermes is widely recognized to have been a god of roads, travel, a watcher and a guardian at the gateways, the intermediary between men and gods, and it isn't hard to see the connection between the god of the physical road on earth and the god of the road of the sun and moon, which passes through the gateway represented by the children of Atlas. This connection is further extended to the god's command over herds, and the Pleiades and Hyades are the core stars of the constellation Taurus. Some Pleiades, like Tegeta, seem to be derived from names for regions of the Peloponnese, and with Zeus she birthed Lacedaemon, the mythical king who has the same name as the region of Lacedaemonia, who married Sparta. Dardanus, the ancestor of the Trojans, was a son of the Pleiad Electra and Zeus, making him a very close brother to Hermes. Sisyphus, the trickster who chained up death and escaped from Hades, but was forever forced to roll a stone uphill, married the Pleiad Merope, who bore Glaucus, the king and founder of Corinth, and father of Bellerophontes. All the sons of the Pleiades, in local traditions, were linked closely to ancient ancestral figures. Yet this raises an interesting question. Why is Hermes a god, and all of these other sons of Pleiad nymphs with Zeus or Poseidon are founding kings, but are mortals? The children of nymphs were, by default, mortals. Only Hermes stands out in this. But unfortunately, there is no myth that survives that gives an explanation. What is clear from stories, however, is that Hermes is one of the most human of the gods. Maia was born on Mount Kyllene, called the House of Atlas. The nymph, Kyllene, was sometimes named as the wife of Pelasgus, the first king of the Pelasgians. He gave his name to the Peloponnese, and was father to Lycaon, though other accounts say that Kyllene was the wife of Lycaon and mother of his 50 sons, mostly named for various towns in Arcadia. Maia was in turn said to have raised Argos, the grandson of Lycaon, by his daughter Callisto and Zeus. Hermes was raised by Kyllene, or sometimes thought to be raised by Acacus, son of Lycaon. And yet another myth tells that Pan, usually the son of Hermes, was the son of Callisto and Zeus, and divine brother to Argos. Though many versions of the myths exist, it was commonly thought that Lycaon had his son Nyctis, meaning night, sacrificed, and tried to feed his flesh to Zeus as a test of the god. Nyctis was brought back to life by Zeus, and Lycaon was transformed into a wolf as punishment, and his other sons killed, or in some myths also transformed into wolves. In other accounts, it was Arcas, his grandson, who was sacrificed. Roman poets Lucan and Martial give Arcas as an epithet for Hermes. It might be that the mountain nymph Kyllene and Maia, the nymph born on Kyllene, were in origin the same. Lycaon instituted the worship of Zeus Lycaon, and it's likely representative in some way of the god and the most ancient layer of his cult. On Mount Lycaon, there has now been recovered from beneath the massive pile of ash that formed the god's altar the human remains of a boy, sacrificed at the site probably sometime before 1000 BC, and the legend may reflect this event. But also on the mountain was a sanctuary of Pan Lycaon, associated with the Lycian Games that featured the first athletic competitions. The cult of Pan Lycaon was said to have been brought to Italy by Evandros, son of Hermes, and a Latin ancestral figure who immigrated to Italy from Arcadia, bringing the worship of Hermes and Pan Lycaon, and establishing the Lupercalia, named for the wolf. But for now, let us retrace our steps from this route, for there are other avenues that must be explored before this path will become clear. Hermes is consistently associated with figures linked to wolves, bears, or other animals. Most famously, his son Pan is a goat man, but he was also said to be the father of Ophthalicus, the wolf itself, the Satyroi, one of which is named Wolf, and Cephalus, who, united with a she-bear, gave birth to Arcesius, a name also derived from bear, the grandfather of Odysseus on his father's side in many accounts, a tale similar to that of Callisto and Arcas. The Homeric hymn to Hermes says that he was born and dwelt in a cave on Mount Kyllene. Despite extensive searches, no cave there has ever been found. A play by Sophocles, tracking satyrs, that survives only in fragments, may explain. When Silenus and a group of satyrs are sent searching for Apollo's missing cattle, stolen by Hermes, they end up at Mount Kyllene. The satyrs can hear music, and they put their ears to the earth to listen. Silenus at first doesn't understand what they are doing, but when he too hears the strange, enchanting music coming from somewhere beneath the earth, he threatens to stomp and leap upon the ground until whoever is down there comes out. Instead of Hermes appearing, Kyllene, the nymph of the mountain, appears to them and tries to shoo them away. She eventually admits the tale, saying that Zeus came to the house of Atlas and Hermes is in there, and that she is bringing him up herself, for his mother's strength is shaken by sickness as if by a storm. That the Pleiades are linked to storms is not surprising. In the Argonautica, it says that, "As when Zeus darts the lightning from his high citadel, aye, when he stirs the Pleiades, and mingled rains and thunder, or freezing snow, when the whole plain is hidden by the white downpour. By heaven's law Zeus had drawn the Pleiades, stormy constellation, down from the firmament, as he rolled the earth upon its everlasting course, and straightway rain streamed everywhere." Nymphs are often thought to reside in wet, subterranean caves, rivers, springs, flowery meadows, and places that are damp or wet. They spread around water, which maintains fertility, creating dew, mists, and clouds. Nymphs that carry water up into the sky are called clouds, which form the basis of a common epithet for Zeus, cloud gatherer. So Hermes is the son of a rain star and the thunder wielder, and in a very archaic point in Greek myth, he was likely linked to clouds and rains, which does make him a suitable herald for Zeus the Thunderer. In this way, he comes to be associated with fertile forces generally, like those contained within rains that ensure growth. So he is pictured as growing very rapidly in his subterranean location after a storm. The pastoral god must ensure the flowing waters for flocks to drink and plants to grow. This function becomes entirely monopolized by Zeus later, but there are traces remaining to Hermes. In the Homeric hymn, Hermes is described as an autumn breeze or mist, and in the Odyssey, he guides Odysseus' ship when clouds covered the night sky and mist was upon the waters. He is said to unite with all manner of nymphs, bringing fertility to the land. The murder of his son, Myrtilus, is said to be the cause of the dryness of the Peloponnese and brought on an extreme drought. The name Hermes is related to the word for a stone pile, a hermai. They are featured along roads or near boundaries, and there is some evidence that these stone heaps may have had a religious role in the Mycenaean period or even earlier. In their most archaic form, they were but loose rocks piled together, though often they had a pillar stone in the middle or beside them, perhaps suggestive of the pillars which his grandfather was said to maintain. Eventually, some were topped with the head of a deity, sometimes with genitalia. The heads on the pillars did not always represent Hermes, but sometimes Dionysus or other gods or local heroes. And though the erect penis on some of the pillars is thought to represent fertility, it isn't necessarily the case in all examples. They are usually placed to mark boundaries, to act as guides and protective symbols. The erect penis may have been a sign of power and hostility towards harmful forces. Consider the words often in modern discourse used as an insult or threat, F-U, and what it represents. Phallic imagery was to ward off the evil eye. Secondarily, it relates to fertility, in that fertility drives off the evil of the infertile and destructive. Even in ancient Greece, their form was not really understood. It was said to have been taught by the Pelasgians. The word hermai does not only refer to the heap of rocks, but also to a prop, support, a defense, a hill, a band or earring, a noose, or coils. There is an underlying theme to these meanings, stemming from an Indo-European root, ser, meaning to bind, to put together, or protect. The Mycenaean word hermata in Linear B, spelled emata, meant straps. The Mycenaean form of Hermes, the name of the god, is in Linear B, Ema. This is strong evidence that the name Hermes is of Proto-Indo-European origin. This root, ser, is the origin also for the Persian Hara, meaning guard or bind, from the mythical mountain Hara Barazaiti, thought to mean the high guard post or watch post. Ser also gives rise to West Germanic sarwa, meaning armor, Italic servos, meaning guardian, Greek hero, meaning to fasten or join, ormos, a cord or a chain, but also a haven or shelter, Latin sermo, meaning conversation, one who binds together words. There are many possibilities for the interpretation of the meaning and the purpose of the binding referred to, but there is often found a concept of defense associated with it. Bonds secure things, make them safe. When we look at the function of the Hermi, there are two main roles that perhaps have this same meaning. They are boundary markers and symbols of protection. They stand as guards along roads, borders, and in front of doors. And when we think of the etymology of boundary, right, it comes from the word bind. The link between Hermes and bonds shows up in a number of myths. Perhaps the most graphic example is a cult site in Crete dedicated to him and Aphrodite, where representations of the goddess in both human and tree form have been dedicated bound with straps. In the Homeric hymn, Apollo attempts to bind Hermes, yet the bonds fall away, then grow like vines from beneath his feet and spread all over the cattle, creating the first cattle bindings. He creates sandals through weaving strands of tamarisk and myrtle twigs together and binding them to his feet. When Aphrodite and Ares are caught in the net of Hephaestus and are being mocked, Apollo jokes that Hermes probably desires to lay with her, and Hermes boasts that even if many more chains were put about him, he would still lay with her before all the gods and goddesses. What may be meant is that no amount of bonds would be able to hold him like they held Ares. That he was a god of boundaries marked out by the Hermi also corresponds to this idea. Some sources also say that it was Hermes and not Hephaestus that bound Prometheus to the stone. Finally, the Homeric hymn establishes him as the god of exchange and commerce between men, solidified by contracts. Yet it is likely that this idea of binding is merged with the notion of protection and guarding, as in other examples, so that his name may mean the guarder or watchman as equally as the binder. Indeed, one of his epithets calls him the doorman, or the guardian at the door. Now, his name is but one aspect of his nature, but its etymology is clearly Indo-European, because it matches with his many functions. If one derives an etymology that does not match at all with the character of a god, then that etymology should be called into question. But when there is an etymology that is probable or possible that matches directly with the character, nature, and myths of the god, then that is the most likely possibility, and that is the case here. Not much is known about the worship of Hermes in the Mycenaean period, but there are a few clues. Stone heaps feature in some Mycenaean art, but they may be present in pre-Mycenaean art of Crete, which features a so-called pre-Greek master of animals, and this may be evidence to suggest certain continuity. In the Homeric hymn, Zeus grants to Hermes mastery over horses and mules, flocks and herds, prophetic birds, hounds, lions, and boars with gleaming tusks. He was father to Pan, and a great lover of nymphs, and his earliest identity was as a herdsman. In pottery from the archaic and classical periods, He is often featured with animals, and sometimes monsters. He is shown subduing Cerberus with a gesture of his hand, standing happily between lions, petting the chimera, gently tending horses, fighting alongside a lion, and is often in the company of Heracles performing his monster fighting feats, or just chilling out together over a drink. Sometimes in scenes with other gods where beasts are present, he will be staring down directly to the animal rather than looking at any of the other gods. A hound will sometimes be in his company, and there is certainly a connection between him and animals that cannot be overlooked. Yet this is similar to other Indo-European deities identified with Hermes, and so it's hard to say if this is really a feature of the so-called pre-Greek master of animals, or rather the feature of an Indo-European master of animals. Lions were a major symbol of Mycenaean power, the apex predator of Bronze Age Greece, still today a symbol of nobility and fierceness. Perhaps most famous are the lions that stand on the gates of Mycenae. They appear to be the guardians of the gateway, a role of Hermes, represented by one of his symbolic animals. An epithet given to him in Mycenaean times was Areus, meaning warlike. It isn't a feature that survives much in myths, but there are traces of it. The association with wild beasts is suggested by Lycaon, the wolf man, having been one of the first to build him a temple. Ophthalmos, meaning the wolf itself, the legendary thief and grandfather of Odysseus, was the son of Hermes, as are the Satyroi, imagined as animalistic men, one of whom is named Lycos, the wolf. He fathers Pan, who is a goat god, or the multiple Panes. He is also closely connected to Argos, the bear. The wolf especially is characterized as a thief because it steals its meal from the herd by night. It is largely for this reason Hermes is characterized as a tricky thief. It represents the qualities of the thief of the flock, the cunning wolf. Apollo says in the Homeric hymn, "You will plague many a lonely herdsman in mountain glades when you come on the herd and thick-fleeced sheep and have a hankering after flesh." This imagines Hermes as the wolf or the lion. Hermes is often depicted as being hungry, something not said of other gods. In the Odyssey, a shepherd sets apart a full portion of the divided meal for Hermes and the nymphs, and utters prayers to the god. But what would happen to this meal set aside for Hermes? It may have been eaten by dogs, wolves, or other scavengers. He is said to crave after meat, to savor even the smell of it, and one of his epithets is Bophonos, slayer of cattle. In the comedic play Plutus, Hermes complains that he has stopped receiving sacrifices and is so hungry he can only lay around all day with his legs in the air. In other words, he is pictured like a hound. He was a god of lions, and very frequently found in the company of Heracles. The first feat of Heracles was to kill the Nemean lion, and Hermes is almost always shown with Heracles as he wrestles the lion. Heracles takes that lion's skin and wears it as his armor, representing the archaic warrior transformation. Like the impervious berserker, the bear shirter, Heracles is made invincible by his lion shirt, but that lion is connected to Hermes, the master of the lion. The god is sometimes given the epithet Diaktoros by Homer, and this has long been misunderstood. Though often translated as minister or messenger, its true meaning seems to come from the verb dioko, meaning to pursue, seek, chase, or hunt, conveying, in the case of Hermes, the pursuer or hunter. His son Pan is also a hunter, and the fear that Pan causes, panic, is related to the sense of being hunted. The other animal very significant to Mycenaeans and all European warriors was the boar. Across Europe, the boar was a symbol of the warrior. Mycenaean warriors created helmets out of the tusks of boars that they had hunted down, proving their prowess against the fierce and deadly creature, and the hunt of the Caledonian boar, which took place in Arcadia, is but one very ancient example. Hunting the boar is thought to have been part of a warrior's rite of passage in ancient Mycenaean society, and that Hermes is a god of this creature connects him with this ancient rite. Hermes was still, in the classical period and beyond, the god who oversaw the rite of passage of young men through local competitive festivals called Hermaia. In Crete, there was an ancient tradition, continued unbroken since at least the Mycenaean period, where young men would reside in a remote location under the tutelage of an older man, and were expected to hunt and kill in the mountains as part of their rite of passage into manhood. Hermes was the male god of the sanctuary of Cyrna. He was given the epithet Enagonius or Argonius, especially in Arcadia, meaning of contests, competitions, combats. Pindar cites Hermes as the lord of competitions several times in his poems. This is often translated as games, to fit with the more typical perception of Hermes. Yet these men were not playing dice. They were fighting or competing in athletic contests. He governed the arts of combat which the men were engaged in, and was the patron deity of the palestra, widely recognized as a god specifically of wrestling. His divine daughter was Palestra, the name of the wrestling school, and his son, Aphtholikos, taught wrestling to Heracles. Boxing was also done there, and it was the core of the gymnasium. In the Iliad, Zeus was said to have held the scales when weighing out fates of warriors in battle. Yet in artistic depictions, Hermes is always the one holding the scales. Hermes' link to this in practice was archaic. Fighting strength is linked to the fierceness of animals such as lions, wolves, bears, or boars, and may have involved practices where warriors adopted the characteristics of the animal. Hermes is called Kratos, strong. In the Homeric hymn, Apollo marvels at his physical strength. In art, Hermes can be found bearing a spear or sword, and sometimes dressed in full armor. One depiction shows him fighting a giant alongside a lion. In some locations, he was called Promachos, meaning the warrior on the front lines. A story is told in the region of Tanagra that he saved the city from an invasion by personally leading the youths straight out of the wrestling ring and onto the battlefield without anything but their strigils for weapons, and they won. He was said to have defeated Ares in a boxing match for the hand of the nymph Tanagra, who gave her name to the town. He is also called Savior, said to have rescued a town from a plague by carrying a ram upon his back and circling the city. Of all the Olympian gods, Hermes is depicted as the most human, and despite his wolfish nature, the most benevolent towards man, called the giver of all good things. In the Homeric hymn to Hestia, goddess of the hearth and home, the two gods are invoked together to safeguard the house. Pausanias records several instances where depictions of Hermes stand beside Hestia. The herdsman was an important figure in the early Indo-European society, as with many others, and it's the role which seems to be the foundation stone of the nature of Hermes, even more so than his role as herald. The flocks, cattle, and horses were the wealth and food of the early Indo-Europeans who were in origin primarily pastoral. The herder was at once a warrior and a trader. He had to be able to guide the herd down safe paths, drive them to new pastures, or take them to distant markets, protect them from wolves, lions, and boars, and also raiders. Yet the herder was himself a raider, and these raids formed the basis of a great deal of Indo-European warfare. In Ireland and Scotland, this type of raiding warfare didn't end until the early modern period, and so the herdsman of the Indo-European society was highly involved in martial activity as well as theft. It is this nature of the herdsman which is strongly connected to Hermes. It's also related to his most important myths, and the origin for his alternative name, used by Homer nearly as frequently as Hermes, Argifontes. Throughout the Iliad and Odyssey, Homer calls Hermes Argifontes. This is not an epithet. It is a standalone name, which is used to refer to the god by Homer only slightly less frequently than the name Hermes. No explanation of this name is given by Homer, but Hesiod may have mentioned it in a work that doesn't survive. It is thought to mean slayer of Argos. Argos was the name of a two-headed, four-eyed giant herdsman that guarded the cow Io. There are several versions of this tale in writing and art, and using them to reconstruct the framework of the original tale, it may have went as follows. Zeus fell in love with a woman named Io, a priestess of Hera. But when Hera discovered them, Zeus changed her into a cow. Hera demanded Io from Zeus as a gift, and he complied to try to hide her identity. But Hera knew exactly what was going on, and she placed Argos Panoptes, the all-seeing giant, to serve as her herdsman. Zeus asked Hermes to retrieve the cow. The pursuit was not an easy one. Hermes had to track him down, accompanied by a hawk sent by Zeus. Some say it was the hawk which Argos noticed and prevented Hermes from stealing off with the cow. A battle ensued, in which Hermes gained the upper hand. Argos tries to make off with the cow, fleeing his pursuer in desperation, driving the cow madly before him. But Hermes, swift in pursuit, cast a stone, striking him down. The slayer of oxen, Hermes, then comes upon the fallen herdsman, who is begging for mercy. He grabs him roughly by the hair of his head, and decapitates him with his golden sword. Zeus looks on approvingly, pleased at the return of his dear Io. The Roman poet Ovid says Hermes lulled Argos to sleep and killed him, but this does not match any Greek description or depiction. In the earliest depictions, Argos is Janus-headed, but later he is shown with eyes covering his entire body. In the Iliad, Argifontes is often accompanied by other descriptors like Kratos, meaning strong, Evskopas, keen-sighted, but most often with diaktoros. Traditionally, this word diaktoros has been translated as minister or messenger. It actually comes from the verb dioko, meaning to run, chase, pursue, seek, or hunt. In the context of diaktoros Argifontes, Homer is calling him the seeker, pursuer, or hunter, fitting exactly with the tale in which he must pursue, hunt down Argos to retrieve the cow. This myth is part of the original aspect of the Indo-European herdsman, who was at once a guardian of the herd and also a raider of herds. Such a tale forms the heart of Irish myth, the Tan Bo Cuailnge. Though it is later given a localized expression in relation to the city of Argos, its origin probably predates even that ancient city. Io is said to be from Argos. She was a priestess of Hera and a daughter of Inachus, a local river. Her mother is Melia, an Oceanid nymph. Her role in the ancestry of the Greeks is pivotal, being an ancestor of the entire line, such as Cadmus, Heracles, Perseus, of Europa, even Dionysus. The myth was also not purely local to the city of Argos, for Hesiod mentions that Io was changed into a cow in the island of Euboea, named for her. In the Iliad, Argives is a name that can be used to refer to all Greeks fighting with Agamemnon in Troy. Argos, the earth-born, suspiciously has the same name as Argos, the city. Earlier depictions of him show him as a Janus-headed figure or with an eye on the back of his head. In the city of Argos, there was an ancient wooden depiction of Zeus, which had an eye in its forehead. Arges is also a name given to one of the earth-born Cyclopes by Hesiod, and it might be that Argos was in origin a Cyclops. Odysseus, descendant of Hermes, also must battle a Cyclops. It is possible that there is an ancient connection between the city of Argos and a Cyclopean-style god, but the full scope of this myth goes beyond the limitations of this presentation. The role of Hermes and the origin of his name Argefontes is as the killer of the herdsman or cattle rustler of this primordial cow on behalf of Zeus. In the play Prometheus Bound, Hermes slays Argos at Lerna. Io says, "Stung by a sharp-fanged gadfly, I rushed with frantic bounds to Cerchna's sweet stream and Lerna's spring. But Argos, the earth-born herdsman, untempered in his rage, pursued me, peering with his many eyes upon my steps. Unexpectedly, an unforeseen fate robbed him of his life." Hermes is not called by name here, but rather referred to as the robber of Argos's life, this unexpected moros, meaning fate, destiny, or doom. Lerna was thought to hold an entrance to the underworld. Possibly the myth involved Hermes freeing this primordial cow from the underworld. In comparative analysis, the myth has similar features to the reconstructed Proto-Indo-European creation myth involving the stolen cow. The first warrior herdsman must retrieve the cow on behalf of the Sky Father. Another well-known tale of Hermes is his theft of the cattle of Apollo. The story, as preserved in the Homeric hymn to Hermes, is comical, and at times can even feel as though it was written by someone intentionally mocking the god. Though called Homeric, it was written several hundred years after the Iliad, likely around 530 BC or thereabouts. It presents Hermes as an infant and younger than Apollo, in contrast to his depiction in art up until this time. It continues the cattle rustling theme while adding another mystery layer. What are the cattle that Hermes steals? In the Odyssey, Helios has 350 immortal cows, corresponding to the number of days in a year calculated at that time on Eastern calendars. They are watched over by Helios's two daughters, Phaethusa, meaning radiance, and Lampetia, meaning shining. Elsewhere, the names of the horses that pull the chariot of dawn. These cows may be representative of the light of the sun, portioned out into the number of days in the solar year according to the ancient Eastern calendar. However, there is likely an overlap of meaning. The cattle are real cattle, which Hermes desires to eat, but they are also symbolic of something more. In the hymn, though the cattle are introduced as belonging to Apollo, there is reason to believe that they are directly related to the sun. It reads, "Helios was going down beneath the earth towards Okeanos with his horses and his chariot, when Hermes came hurrying to the shadowy mountains of Pieria, where the divine cattle of the blessed gods had their steads." The mountains of Pieria refers to the region north and including Mount Olympus, associated with Hermes by Homer, a region that in most ancient times was under Thracian control. He takes the cattle at sunset, drives them south through the night over an impossible distance in the Peloponnese, feeds and cares for them, performs a strange version of a sacrifice, and hides the rest in the cave before dawn. The hymn suggests that Hermes did not eat any of the cattle, as eating the flesh is not something that immortals do, yet the theft was entirely motivated by Hermes' desire to eat, for he had a hankering for flesh, a description used for lions or wolves. When dawn begins her climb and Apollo goes forth, he realizes the cattle are missing and asks an old man who has spotted Hermes if he had seen the cattle, saying, "These were left behind, the dogs and the bull, which is a great marvel, but the cows strayed out of the soft meadow away from the pasture when the sun was just going down." Does the bull refer to the constellation Taurus, left behind in the night sky while the cattle disappear with the setting of the sun? The old man explains to Apollo, "He was driving them backward ways with their heads towards him." Does this refer to the rays of the light emanating from the sun moving away? Of course, setting aside possible solar connections, he subdues the dogs and drives the cattle backwards, an amazing feat granting him the title God of Herding. There is a dynamic of time at play, and the narration stresses time often, with Hermes born at dawn, making the lyre at midday, then emerging from his cave to steal the cattle at dusk, driving them through the night, feeding them and sacrificing just before dawn. Hermes says to Zeus of Apollo, "He came to our house today, looking for his shambling cows, as Helios was newly rising." In his declaration, the god says, "I did not drive his cows to my house, so may I prosper, nor cross the threshold. This I say truly. I reverence Helios greatly, and the other gods, and you I love, but him I dread." Why does he refer to Helios when on the surface he has nothing to do with the events? The most plausible reason is because the cattle that Hermes stole were the cattle of Helios, and Apollo is standing in as the sun god in the hymn. An early occurrence for this level of identification between the two gods, but it seems to be what is meant. Hermes returns with Apollo and releases the cattle out of the cave, and after, Hermes wows with the lyre. Apollo grants Hermes the whip for driving the cattle, signifying him as the master of herds. It might be that, like the herdsman driving the cattle out to graze in the morning and driving them back to the safety of the cave at night, Hermes so herds the light of the sun up from the earth at dawn and down into it at night. This also relates to the other gift Apollo grants him, the golden wand, the Caruceon, Latin caduceus. Now, in the hymn, this is not described specifically as such, but I think that we should assume that it's the same caduceus that is described by Homer and every other poet. In the Iliad, it is said to cause men to sleep and to rise men from slumber. This is the impelling power associated with sunrise and sunset. So Hermes is granted several solar-related powers in relation to his role as master of the road the sun drives upon, and the guardian at the horizon gates, and the boundaries which the sun must cross. He is related to the influence of the sun at particular times of day as he relates to its movement. He is born at dawn, invents the lyre at midday, expressing the full creative and auspicious power of the sun at its height. But then, as the sun sets, he steals away the light and takes on the trickster and hunter element of the wolf. Hermes was the father of Cephalus, meaning head or the top part, by Herse, meaning dew or raindrops, the daughter of Zeus, and the moon, possibly preserving Hermes in a role of distributing dew. Cephalus was wooed and carried away by Eos, the dawn. but he was always seeking after and marries Procris, a name also meaning dew, and he has a magic spear that never misses its mark, but when out hunting atop a hill, Procris comes without him knowing. Hearing her and thinking she is a wild beast, he throws his spear and kills her. This may be a very ancient story involving the sun or the light of the sun. In the Rig Veda, the sun is considered to be the lover of the dew and the killer of the dew, as the dew forms before dawn but then is evaporated by the sun's rays. So Eos carries him up in love. He marries the dew, then kills her with his spear, the hot rays of light. Most versions also make this Cephalus the great-grandfather of Odysseus. Both great-grandsons of Hermes, Jason and Odysseus, have a close relationship with the sun. Odysseus, with the help of Hermes, thwarts Circe, the daughter of Helios, then becomes her lover, securing her aid. Jason is aided and marries Medea, granddaughter of Helios. This dynamic is notable because in a hymn contained in the Rig Veda, dating possibly to 1600 BC, the pastoral god of pathways, Pushan, marries the daughter of the sun, and it seems there is a similar element preserved in the myths of the descendants of Hermes. Hermes may be covertly linked to certain solar functions in the Odyssey. Odysseus arrives at the island of Circe, landing in silence, guided by an unnamed god. He and his men are starving, and he goes out to look for something. Then a great deer bounds before him, gifted to him, says Odysseus, again by an unnamed god. But he follows up this by saying that previously the deer had been dwelling in the shade of the trees, but had gone forth to drink, for he was driven by the oppressive heat of the sun. These types of random boons are nearly always ascribed to Hermes. The god has a similar relationship with animals as Circe, and they have a history together, for she declares to Odysseus that Argefontes long ago told her that he would come there. Circe's name means circle, and it may refer to the circle of the sun. The exchanging of duties and items between Hermes and Apollo in the Homeric hymn is not only to try and clarify the functional roles between these two solar-related gods, but also to illustrate lordship over the process of exchange. Hermes even skillfully barters for oracular powers. The process of exchange is a type of contract, and Hermes oversaw contracts that took place between buyers and sellers. This role is related also to his pastoral origin, but also has a relationship with the sun. The herdsman must drive the cattle to market and trade them. Markets were first sites of cattle trading, and cattle were the prime source of mobile wealth in the ancient world. As he governs roads, which were used for driving cattle, he governs the trading of those cattle. Yet the sun is the ultimate witness in many contracts and oaths, because he is the one who sees all. This association seems to have led to Persian Mithra, the god of contract, whose name means the one who binds, eventually becoming the sun rather than related to particular solar aspects. In Hellenistic Persia, Mithra was at least in one location equated to Helios, Apollo, and Hermes as a singular entity. In a separate but related myth to that found in the Homeric hymn, when Hermes was stealing the cattle of Apollo, Batos saw him from atop his ridge. He asked for payment in exchange for keeping silent. Hermes granted the request, but made Batos swear to uphold his end of the bargain. After he hid the cattle, Hermes changed his appearance and returned to Batos, offering robes as a reward for information. Batos broke his word and revealed what he had seen. Hermes then struck him with his staff and turned him to stone. showing that Hermes punishes those who break their vows and contracts. That Hermes punishes by turning someone to stone is another element of binding power, able to rob one of all mobility. After Apollo and Hermes exchange goods, Apollo fears that Hermes will steal them back, and so Hermes swears he will not steal from the far shooter, and Apollo swears that he will be his friend, loved above all other immortals, and Zeus sends his eagle to confirm the great oath. Hermes also swears a false oath in the hymn, and Autolycus, son of Hermes, was said to be a master in shifty oaths. Yet part of this hymn is clearly striving to delineate Apollo and Hermes. Yet besides the role of the herdsman, Hermes is the herald of the gods. But to understand this, we need to know what an ancient herald, the Kyros, was. The word itself may have been adopted from the pre-Greek population. Alternatively, the Kyros might be related to an ancient root kara, meaning to sing. Whatever the case, the role associated with it seems to contain ideas that were common to Indo-Europeans. Already by the time of Homer, there are signs that the ancient significance of this position was not fully understood, but there are remnants of an early sacred function. The first is that the Kyros was untouchable. They may walk through a battlefield, and no one on either side was permitted to strike them. They were under the protection of Zeus himself, yet their god was Hermes. They carried a special staff that signified their position. In the Archaic period, this was not the rod with two intertwined snakes, a later Hellenistic adaptation, but a type of circular formation possibly representative of binding. They spoke with the authority of their king, and also accompanied the king in many tasks. When Priam, king of Troy, ventures to the camp of the Greeks, the only one he takes with him is his herald. Heralds were also present and took part in important rituals and ceremonies, sometimes carrying sacrificial victims. They called assemblies and held authority over those in attendance. They also administered over competitions. The heralds, Talthybius and Idaeus, one Trojan, one Greek, separate Ajax and Hector in the midst of combat, ordering them to stop the fight. And they are heeded. The two are mighty lords and warriors, yet they obey the commands of heralds. This is because the heralds were enforcing rules and customs on behalf of the gods. The heralds proclaim to them that both are equally honored by Zeus, but that the behest of night may not be denied. Ajax and Hector then exchange weapons and part as friends. But how was it that Talthybius and Idaeus were trusted to enforce sacred rules and even hold power over kings in particular situations? In the most ancient times, still dimly reflected in Homer, the herald was not a servant of a king, but was the herald of men and gods. In an earlier period, his position may have entailed memorization of sacred laws and customs, the ability to interpret the will of the gods, and the enforcement of sacred rules and traditions. Some of those functions remained, like the overseeing of competitions during festivals and the gathering of assemblies. But as the Iliad shows, their oversight over competitions may have originally included aspects of warfare. They are not breaking up two competitors in the Olympic Games, but on a hotly contested battlefield. They proclaim the will of Zeus in the matter, and heralds on both sides, Greek and Trojan, working together to do so. A king would have been captured or killed on the battlefield, not the herald. And this shows that his position and power did not emanate from the king he may have been acting on behalf of, but the gods. This is also why Priam only brings a herald with him, thinking to claim some measure of safety under his divine protection, which actually manifests as the god of the herald comes and escorts him there and back personally. Later, because of their unassailable status, they were used to carry messages, but in earlier times the position seems to have been comparable to the Irish Fili or the Vates, which may share an etymological origin with the name Odin. They memorized laws and traditions and acted as interpreters of the gods. This appears to be why Hermes is associated with prophecy. When attempting comparative analysis, this aspect of Hermes is often overlooked, but is one of his oldest characteristics. In the Odyssey's opening book, Zeus explains, "Even as now Aegisthus, beyond that which was ordained, took to himself the wedded wife of the son of Atreus, and slew him on his return, though well he knew of sheer destruction, seeing that we spoke to him before, sending Hermes, the keen-sighted Argifontes, that he should neither slay the man nor woo his wife. For from Orestes shall come vengeance for the son of Atreus, when once he has come to manhood, and longs for his own land. So Hermes spoke, but for all his good intent, he prevailed not upon the heart of Aegisthus." This is both Hermes acting as the mouthpiece of the gods among humans, but also acting as a prophet, for he warns of the fate which has not yet come to pass. Circe, daughter of Helios, also says that Hermes had long ago told her that Odysseus would come there on his travels. And when Hermes speaks to Odysseus, he tells him exactly what would happen if he hadn't intervened, and just what Circe will do when he arrives and how to counter her, showing that he has complete knowledge of that which has yet to occur. But more than that, for through his intervention, he can actively change the outcomes if he is heeded. This relation to fate comes up in his association with lots, with which Odysseus is shown to have great success in. Anything good that happens unexpectedly was attributed to the actions of Hermes. If someone finds a treasure unexpectedly, it is called a Hermaion, and those who found it were required to share it evenly. The Homeric hymn has Hermes barter with Apollo for skill in oracles, ending up only with lots and with the Threa nymphs, also located on Mount Parnassus. Hermes finds a tortoise outside his mother's cave and takes this as a great sign, a symbolos, which in plural refers to tallies, but of course in English we know it as symbol. Even the farts of Hermes are portrayed as omens, by which Apollo declares he will find the cattle. Apollo then says Hermes will be an omen of the gods, but refuses him the art of prophetic speech. But this is at odds with the Odyssey, where Hermes is clearly depicted as having the power of prophecy. In some local myths, Pan, the son of Hermes, was the one to teach prophecy to Apollo. The cave of the nymphs, located on Parnassus, was closely connected with Pan, with inscriptions to him within the cave. The monopoly over prophecy by Apollo seems to have pushed aside Hermes and even Zeus among the educated classes sometime between Homer and the Homeric hymns. The herald would have to be able to know and proclaim the will of the gods, or he would not be a herald. Though Dodona, the site of prophetic Zeus, continued, it was much overshadowed by Parnassus, and was visited more by those of the lower classes, just as those who continue to follow Hermes in his prophetic role. Autolycus, Odysseus' grandfather, is asked to name the child, and he decides to name him Odysseus, from Odo, meaning anger or pain. Explained by Autolycus, "Just as I have come from afar, creating pain for many, men and women across the good green earth, so let his name be Odysseus, the son of pain, a name he'll earn in full, and when he has come of age and pays a visit to Parnassus, the great estate of his mother's line, where all my treasures lie." The son of Hermes lives on Parnassus, and prophetically names his grandson for the great suffering that he will endure, or potentially understood as the great anger that he will incur from the gods. The sacred role of the herald is probably also reflected in the tradition which makes Hermes the originator of fire from the fire sticks and performing sacrifice. The force fire, that is, fire created from fire sticks, was seen as the most holy form of fire, and altar fires could only be started by force fires or from fires which had come from another sacred source. The specific form of sacrifice performed by Hermes in the Homeric hymn is actually unknown from other sources, leaving some scholars puzzled as to its meaning. It may have been a local tradition, perhaps even specific to the worship of Hermes. However, we should not, as some have concluded from this, believe that Hermes is the god of fire, which the hymn says is Hephaestus. It is rather that Hermes is the herald because he is the intermediary between man and gods, represented as the lord of the road connecting heaven and earth in the underworld. But because the fire god Agni is in the Rig Veda often called the herald of the gods, people have wanted to connect these two things, but there doesn't really seem to be a very strong connection there. Hermes is also the most kindly of the gods towards men. His main action in the Iliad is when he helps Priam to retrieve the body of Hector, which all the gods wished Hermes to steal from Achilles out of pity. Homer says in Book 24, "The twain were not unseen by Zeus, but as he saw the old man he had pity, and forthwith spoke to Hermes his dear son. Hermes, seeing as you love above all others the companionship of man, and you give ear to whomsoever you are minded, go and guide Priam to the hollow ships of the Achaeans, in such wise that no man may see him or beware of him among all the Danaans, until he comes to the son of Peleus." He appeared to Priam as a young prince, with the first bit of down upon his lip. Priam's herald first thinks the man will tear them to pieces, describing him as if he were a lion or a wolf. Priam is terrified, but Homer says, "The kindly god himself, coming closer, took the old man's hand and spoke to him. 'I will do you no harm myself. I will even keep another off you who would.' Priam responds saying, 'There is some god who has held his hand above me, who sent such a wayfarer as you to meet me, an omen of good, for such you are by your form, your admired beauty, and the wisdom in your mind.'" He mentions the stretching forth of a hand in relation to Hermes' protection, that he is a good omen and wise. He later calls Hermes best of men, and Hermes says, "I would be your escort and take good care of you, even till I came to glorious Argos in a fast ship, or following on foot, and none would dare fight you because you despised your escort." So said the kindly god. In other words, he would take him even all the way to the heart of the enemy in safety. He then leaps up and takes the reins of the wagon, and breathes great strength into the horses and mules. As they come to the gates, he casts sleep upon the watchman, and unlatches the gates. Once outside Achilles' hut, he declares his true identity to Priam, and instructs him how best to approach the warrior to gain his request. In the Odyssey, when Hermes appears in person to Odysseus, he likewise takes him by the hand. The action is one of friendship and sincerity, as it still is today, and also has connection to guiding. In the Rig Veda, Pushan, the lord of pathways, is asked to take the worshipper by the hand and to lead them along safe pathways. Yet it isn't the last time that he helps Priam. The old man, exhausted from his nighttime adventure and his dealings with Achilles, goes to sleep in his hut. Homer says that when all the gods and men are sleeping, it is only Hermes that sleep never lays hold of. Like Mithra, who is sleepless and ever awake, Hermes remained awake, thinking how he might guide Priam home. He wakes the king and escorts him from the camp and across the river before returning to Olympus at dawn. Hermes is the defender through the night, always watching, like the shepherd guarding his flock. In the play Eumenides by Aeschylus, Apollo says, "You, Hermes, my blood brother, born of the same father, watch over him, true to your name, be his guide, herding this suppliant of mine." In the Iliad it says Hermes was granted a great scepter forged by Hephaestus and given to Zeus. Hermes later gives this symbol of royalty to Pelops, the ancestor of Agamemnon, linking Hermes not only to the herald staff, but also to the scepters of ancient Mycenaean kings. These scepters conveyed authority and privilege of the king in assembly. There is a history beyond this between Hermes and Pelops. Some claimed that Pelops was the son of Atlas, others that he was the son of Hermes, but most said that he was the son of Tantalus, who was a son of Zeus and Dione, daughter of Atlas, making his genealogy very similar to Hermes. Pelops was murdered by his father, who tried to serve him to the gods as a meal, strangely similar to the tale of Lycaon, but only Demeter ate any of it. Afterwards, the gods had Hermes place all the body parts of Pelops into a cauldron and restore him to life. Since Demeter had eaten his shoulder, she replaced it with a shoulder of pure ivory. He strove to win the hand of Hippodamia, she who is master of horses, which he could only do by defeating her father, Oenomaus, wine man, in a chariot race. Oenomaus was the husband of Sterope, the sister of Hermes' mother. He took the head off those who lost the contest against him. Fearful of this, Pelops sought help from Myrtilus, the charioteer of Oenomaus, the son of Hermes, said to be the best chariot driver. He was in love with Hippodamia, and Pelops promised him the first night with her if he would only ensure Oenomaus lost. Myrtilus either let him lose or didn't pin the chariot wheel, and Oenomaus crashed and died. When Myrtilus tried to make a move on Hippodamia, however, Pelops killed him by casting him into the sea. Myrtilus cried out a curse on the land in the name of Zeus Ombrios, meaning of the rains, and caused a drought. Accounts say that there were 9 islands called the Islands of Pelops, and that even when it rained, not a drop of water would fall on them. Others said that he cursed the family of Pelops directly. Hermes is related to nearly all of the main characters in this foundational tale. As in the story of Lycaon, some say Pelops was the first to build a temple and sacrifice to Hermes, and by this he hoped to avert the wrath of the god upon the land from the death of Myrtilus, who gave his name to the nearby sea where he was drowned. Yet why is killing the son of Hermes linked to drought? As we have looked at, the Pleiades were connected with rains and water distribution, which Hermes was perhaps connected to, in the form of the guide of clouds. The family of Pelops was said to suffer a great curse, which included the theft of Helen. A mysterious golden ram appeared in the flock of Pelops, and due to a prophecy, grants whomever has it the kingdom. Atreus' brother steals it. Seneca said, "There is within Pelops' lofty folds a lordly flock and a wondrous ram, the rich flock's leader. Over all his body a fleece of spun gold hangs, and from his back the new-crowned king of the house of Tantalus have their scepters wreathed in gold. His owner rules, him does the fortune of the whole house follow." This golden ram, which serves as a symbol of the kingship, and whose gold goes into the making of the scepters of kings, may relate to Homer's version of Hermes granting Pelops the scepter forged by Hephaestus. However, it results in massive internal strife within the family, perhaps caused intentionally. This golden ram and its significance also aligns with the golden ram in Jason and the Argonauts, and we might wonder if Hermes was the true origin of that golden ram as well. As in the tale of Pelops, the golden ram of Jason is also linked to a drought. The racetrack of Olympia was thought haunted by Myrtilos. Pelops built a mound there to propitiate the murdered son of Hermes, but occasionally he would appear and strike terror into the horses, causing them to bolt and cause crashes which were sometimes fatal. This element of fear associated with Hermes isn't isolated. Pan, son of Hermes, is most famous for panic, based on his name, and the feeling that is engendered by him, the terror that one experiences when they're hunted in the wilds. The story of Pelops is very similar to Celtic myth, and to that of Lycaon, and Hermes is closely connected to the founding myths that also involve death and resurrection. This mortal, who is sacrificed and brought back from the dead, Pelops or Argos, then serves as a king of at least several important royal lines. Hermes was also the father of Saon, the first king of Samothrace, whose name is the same as the mountain upon which the great Samothracian temple was built. His mother, Hrena, may have been the same as the Pleiad Electra, and Saon identified with Iason, who is elsewhere said to be the son of Zeus and twin brother of Dardanos, who went on to found the Trojan people. Hermes was also the father of Bunos, meaning hill, mound, or altar, who became the king of Corinth after Aeetes, son of the sun, left for Colchis. But in a tale with similarities to Pelops and Argos, Hermes is the father of Athalides. He is known from the Argonautica. He was the herald of the Argonauts and has an infallible memory, able to remember even when he crosses into the land of the dead. Because of this, he forever spends 1/2 of his time in the world of the living and 1/2 in the land of the dead, something like Castor and Pollux. He becomes an important figure to the Pythagoreans, and it is said that Pythagoras himself claimed he was the reincarnation of Athalides, and thus a son of Hermes. Hermes is called Egemonio, meaning guide, but literally the one who goes before or leads the way, and thus leader. The Orphic hymn calls Hermes the Koiranos Thniton, leader of mortals. In a play, Plutus, by Aristophanes, Hermes offers to be a guide, but he is rebuffed, saying, the god, Plutus, previously blind, can see well enough now. Rather than his offer being interpreted as leading men, it is thought that he will guide the god, and in myth he often does just this. He can bring gods to mortals, or mortals to the gods. In the beginning of the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite, we are told that Zeus put desire into the heart of the goddess to wed a mortal man, as revenge for her working her powers upon the other immortals. When she encounters Anchises, she tells him that the slayer of Argos caught her up when she was dancing to Artemis and flew her over the vast wilds, and that he told her she would be the wife of Anchises and bear him children. Why does she tell him this story? Anchises accepts her primarily upon the story that it was the will of Argefontes, the guide, that she be his wife. That she used a tale to trick him shows that Hermes was believed to bring good things to men, including wives. As Homer says in the Iliad, Hermes is the most disposed of the gods to helping man. To the shepherd, at least, Hermes was not a trickster or thief, at least primarily, but a patron god revered and trusted. This also relates to his role in bringing Pandora to Epimetheus. Perhaps originally she was, as her name suggests, one of all gifts. Rather than a curse, she may have been a blessing. However, that Hermes is ordered to bring her to Epimetheus by Zeus may have been part of Zeus's trick, sent by the gift-giving god who gives wives. Hermes brings women to men, and he's often featured on wedding vases, leading or alongside the wedded couple. This role is similar to that of Vedic god Pushan, who leads the wife to the husband in marriage, and is thought to be a god of marriage. Hermes presents Pandora, the first wife, and he is used in a lie by Aphrodite to secure the bed of Anchises, who believes that she will be his wife, given to him by Argifontes. The same hymn tells of how Zeus made amends to the father of Ganymedes, but that this was accomplished through Hermes. In the Iliad, Zeus is described as holding the scales of fate of the warriors in battle, but in art, the scales are always held by Hermes. When Heracles tries to steal the tripod of Apollo, Zeus in myth steps in to separate them, sometimes with a thunderbolt. Yet in art, it is often Hermes who is shown to stand between them, acting as Zeus. In many artistic depictions, Hermes is shown accompanying heroes who are known to be favored by Zeus. During the Trojan War, Hermes was said to be one of the gods who fought on the side of the Greeks. Homer says that Hermes, giver of all good, was father of Ephidoros, meaning well-gifted, who is fleet on foot and valiant in battle, one of the commanders of the Myrmidons. Like with the tale of Aphrodite, he was said to have coupled with the mother of Ephidoros, Polymele, who was a dancer of Artemis. In the war, the gods come to blows and are pitted one against another. Poseidon versus Apollo, Hera versus Artemis, Athena versus Ares, and Hephaestus versus Scamander, the river god, and powerful Hermes versus Leto, mother of Apollo. This selection isn't random, but appears to be a collection of opposites. Hephaestus, the fire god, has to fight water. Ares, the raging one, has to fight Athena, the wise. Poseidon, the dark-haired god of the sea, must fight Apollo, the bright one of the sky. Hera, the goddess of marriage, state, and womanhood, versus Artemis, the virgin girl of the wilds. Hermes, then, the guide, versus Leto, the concealed, as her name means. Homer says, "Then the slayer of Argos, guide and guardian, said to Leto, 'Leto, I shall not fight you. It is ill to come to blows with any of Zeus's wives. Therefore boast as you will among the immortals, that you worsted me in fair fight.'" This seems intended to express the god's loyalty to Zeus, but also his unwillingness to engage in such an uneven contest. Evenly matched contests were said to be arranged by Hermes. But there could be another dynamic here, which is the concealing one versus the one who guides through obscurity. Though Hermes does not feature much in the Iliad, there is a character who plays a very large role, who appears to be his mortal double, Odysseus. He is described in identical ways to Hermes, even given identical epithets such as Polymetes, full of cunning, Polytropos, one of many ways. In the Odyssey, he is likewise called Polytlas, meaning much enduring, with tlas being the root of Atlas. He is an excellent orator and greatly skilled in everything, but in the funeral games he puts himself forth in wrestling and running, both sports which Hermes governs. He is also a descendant of the god. His grandfather on his mother's side is Autolycus, the famous cattle rustler and son of Hermes, who is the one who gives Odysseus his name. Odysseus' father is Laertes. The name is formed from Laos, meaning people, and hero, meaning to fasten or string together, from this same root as the name Hermes, meaning the one who joins together the people. The father of Laertes is Acrisius, by some said to be the son of Zeus, but by others, including Aristotle, to be the son of Cephalus, son of Hermes. Just outside Odysseus' village was the hill of Hermes. Yet strangely, in the Iliad, it is not Hermes who is portrayed as aiding Odysseus, but Athena. And it is Athena who is said to have been his patron god. In pottery, Athena and Hermes are very frequently featured together assisting heroes, yet in written sources, often only Athena is mentioned. There are depictions that show Hermes helping Odysseus. He leads his chariot, helps him escape from the Cyclops beneath the ram, and aids against Dolon, who tried to sneak into the Greek camp dressed as a wolf. By chance, Odysseus and Diomedes were on a secret raid of their own at the same time and spotted Dolon. They then hid themselves and managed to capture him, yet does not mention Hermes at all. In a play, Dolon suited up as a wolf and is told by the chorus that all he need do now is pray to Hermes, with the audience knowing that Dolon ends up dead and Hermes helps Odysseus. When Odysseus runs a race in the games, he wins as a result of his competitor slipping on a pile of crap, which goes into his mouth. Athena was said to have caused this, yet given that Hermes is the god of athletics and trickery generally, wouldn't it make more sense if this was the result of Hermes? Odysseus wrestles with Ajax, who is the strongest of the Achaeans, and they come to a draw, a well-matched pair in a sport governed by the god of well-matched pairs. Yet the god is not mentioned. Hermes' absence from various scenes in the Iliad and elsewhere, when he fits a situation and is even depicted in art, seems almost intentional. Instead, Athena has been inserted into roles of this type, leaving Hermes for the potters. And there very well may be a class element here. In both the Iliad and Odyssey, Athena intervenes in the form of a herald, a guide, and a shepherd, despite Hermes being the god of all three of these groups. The Greek soldier Epeius, who built the Trojan horse commissioned by Odysseus, and who helped lead the stealth attack on Troy, is depicted in myths as being helped by Athena. Yet in the city of Argos, according to Pausanias, an ancient wooden statue of Hermes, not Athena, was said to have been dedicated by him, presumably in thanks for his aid. There might be some proof of a literary switcheroo in the Odyssey. Athena is telling Zeus that he should send Hermes to tell Calypso to free Odysseus. She then decides that she will go stir up his son Telemachus, quote, "I will guide him to Sparta and to sandy Pylos." So she spoke, and bound beneath her feet her beautiful sandals, immortal, golden, which were wont to bear her both over the waters of the sea and over the boundless lands, swift as the blasts of wind. In Book 5, when Hermes prepares to depart for the island of Calypso, Homer describes the scene. So he spoke, and the guide, Ergephontes, failed not to hearken. Straightway he bound beneath his feet his beautiful sandals, immortal, golden, which were wont to bear him over the waters of the sea and over the boundless land, swift as the blast of the wind. Homer might have hit copy-paste. These shoes are mostly a defining feature of Hermes, yet Athena is also acting as the guide, the role of Hermes. When Odysseus makes it to the land of the Phaeacians, Athena is said to have cast sleep over him, and then wakes him in the morning, the exact powers of Hermes. Hermes flies to Calypso's cave to deliver the decree of Zeus regarding Odysseus. Calypso is a daughter of Atlas. Her name means hides, and she hides Odysseus. She lives in an island in the very center of the ocean, which is to the far west, and perhaps she is associated with obscuring clouds, or the aspect of Atlas which hides the sun after dark. The goddess bids Hermes welcome, and sits him down at the table, serving him ambrosia and nectar. He insists that she must free Odysseus, and though she becomes angry, she submits. When Hermes leaves, Odysseus comes in, and Calypso sits him down, and it makes clear that he sits in the exact same seat which Hermes had just left. Then she offers him food and drink, as she did to Hermes, but of the kind of mortals, and again it specifies this differentiation, but similarity. The scene confirms the mysterious link between Hermes and Odysseus while not explaining it. And it seems to be that Odysseus is a kind of mortal avatar of Hermes. When Odysseus is with the Phaeacians, Euryalus challenges Odysseus, saying, "I do not liken you to a man that is skilled in contests, such as abound among mortal men, but to one who, faring to and fro with his bent ship, is a captain of sailors who are merchantmen, one who is mindful of his freight, and has charge of a home-born cargo, and the gains of his greed. You do not look like an athlete." His words might as well have been directed to Hermes, god of competitions and athletics, who is at the same time the lord of mercantile endeavors. Archaic depictions of Hermes do not show an athletic youth, but a man of years, with a beard, wry and often shifty looking. After mightily throwing a discus, Odysseus proclaims, "For in all things I am not a weakling, even in all the contests that are practiced among men." Hermes aids Odysseus, most famously providing him with the magical plant Moly, which protects him against Kirka, the sun daughter's magic, and it is likely no coincidence that Hermes shows up to protect him from the daughter of the sun, likely as he aids many a shepherd or laborer working out of doors on long hot days, perhaps by hiding the sun with cloud. Lesser recognized is that Hermes also is the unnamed god who helps guide their ship silently landing upon the island, and also, through the heat of the sun, drives a deer right to Odysseus' spear when they are starving. He also helps Odysseus land on the island near the land of the Cyclopes. It was the best of islands, free of danger, full of sheep, fresh water, and meadows, in a completely natural state without the touch of man. This is the paradise of Hermes. Odysseus says, "Thither we sailed in, and some god guided us through the murky night, for there was no light to see, but a mist lay deep about the ship, and the moon showed no light from heaven, but was shut in by clouds. Then no man's eyes beheld that island, nor did we see the long waves rolling on the beach, until we ran our well-bent ships on shore." This unnamed god is associated with mist and cloud that covers the light of the moon, but also with guiding them safely through the murky night. Odysseus' scheme of escaping from the Cyclopes involves Hermes. When the Cyclops came back to the cave on the next evening after Odysseus had formed his plan to blind him, he unusually brought in all his flock. Normally the rams were left outside. Odysseus says that he straightway drove into the cave, his fat flocks, one and all, and left not one without in the deep court, either from some foreboding, or because a god so bade him. This is critical to Odysseus' plan, which involves using bindings that they can escape underneath the rams. To select the men for the blinding of Polyphemus, Odysseus also draws lots, which come out exactly as he would have chosen them himself. In a depiction in pottery, Hermes is shown present as Odysseus sneaks out beneath the ram. The actions of Hermes and Odysseus further connect him to his mixed relation with the sun. Not only does Odysseus' men steal the sun cattle, but he also ends up on Kirka's island, and it is Hermes who must save him from her. He knows just what she will do, and exactly what Odysseus must do to counter her, gaining her as an aid through the use of crafty oaths. The Sun Maiden and Hermes appear to have known each other, for she says, "Surely you are Odysseus, man of many ways, who Argefontes of the Golden Wand ever said to me would come hither." That Athena ends up as the god of Odysseus rather than Hermes may be due to the imposition of local elite views of Homer and others, which eventually went on to shape religious views broadly. Another mysterious thing about Odysseus is that he is able to travel into the underworld with no help. This is not something said of very many people in Greek myth. In fact, he is one of the only figures. When he questions this, Kirke tells him just not to worry about it. But it may be that he is either being guided by an unnamed god, or that in some way this tale relates to that unnamed god in a mortal form. Now, though the exact reasons may elude us, it's clear from the tricky character of Odysseus, his many skills, his epithets which are identical to Hermes, his tales of traveling to the underworld, his relation to the daughter of the sun, and is in some way fundamentally connected to Hermes, even if we can't precisely say exactly what that original relationship was. The making of the lyre was the very first thing Hermes was sent to do, and he did so without hesitation, from instant thought to deed. The lyre is associated with several qualities of Hermes. It is comprised of strings needing to be bound, and it requires a deft hand to use it. In the Homeric hymn, Hermes also explains a particular secret of how one must play it correctly. Whosoever with wit and wisdom inquires of it cunningly, him it teaches through its sound all manner of things that delight the mind, being easily played with gentle familiarities. For it abhors toilsome drudgery, but whosoever in ignorance inquires of it violently, to him it chatters mere vanity and foolishness. In the Odyssey, Odysseus says, "Thanks to Hermes the guide, who gives all work of our hands the grace and fame that it deserves." The god is associated with the skill of the hand, particularly, from menial household chores to the plucking of a lyre. He is further connected to the hand with his gestures of taking the hand of both Priam and Odysseus. In the comedy Plutus, Hermes comes banging on the door seeking entry and a meal. He offers himself up for work. "I should like to live with you. Take pity and receive me. But how could we employ you here? Place me near the door. I'm a watchman god, and I would shift off the robbers." "Shift off? Ah, but we have no love for shifts. Entrust me with your business dealings." "But we are rich. Why should we keep a haggling Hermes? Let me intrigue for you." No, intrigues are forbidden. We believe in good faith. "I will work it for you as a guide." "But the god sees clearly now, so we have no longer want of a guide." "Well then, I will preside over the assemblies." "Ah, what can you object to in that? Nothing is fitter for Plutus than to give a musical and gymnastic assemblies." How useful it is to have so many names. Here you have found the means of earning your bread. I don't wonder the jurymen so eagerly trying to get entered for so many tribunals. Though a comedy, it shows the idea that Hermes has numerous roles in everyday life, and that he is difficult to narrow down in scope. It is also a tale oddly similar to the story of the Gaelic god Lugh seeking entry to Tara, listing off his various skills to the doorman when seeking entry. The connection to the hand links to skill executed through it, and ultimately all human crafts. In the Vedic scriptures, there is an invocation to perform the sacrifice with the hands of Pushan. The quest of Perseus, as it survives, features Hermes in a supportive role, yet the very earliest depiction of it tells us that it indeed involves Hermes in an important way. Perseus was the legendary founder of Mycenae, the very symbol of Mycenaean power. He is a son of Zeus and Danae, a descendant of Io the cow, whom Hermes freed. Perseus appears in the garb of Hermes. Often the two are depicted together, and sometimes they are only distinguished by the caduceus and the harpe, the sickle-type sword that Perseus carries. There are various versions, but in most, Hermes provides him guidance, his sword, and his shoes, or helps him to get them. The helmet he received of Hades, which made one invisible, yet it is depicted identically to the winged helmet of Hermes. Hermes slays an all-seeing watchman, Odysseus blinds the Cyclops, Lugh slays Balor of the deadly eye, and Perseus slays the Gorgon of the deadly glance. All tales involve combating some creature most notable for their eye or eyes, and may share some type of common origin. Hermes also slays the giant Hippolytus in the Gigantomachy, a name meaning freer of horses, perhaps establishing Hermes as the bane of the horse thief. In art, Hermes is often shown readying horses for riding. In another connection between Hermes and clouds, in a hymn by Callimachus, when the Oceanid children are misbehaving, Tethys calls the Cyclopes on them, the primordial storm gods. She names Arges and Steropes, bright flash and lightning. Yet it is Hermes, Argefontes, the slayer of Arges, who comes instead, playing the boogie, disguising himself as the Cyclopes, with ash to make himself appear dark. The child runs to her mother in fear and promises to behave. Tethys is the goddess responsible for distributing fresh waters. Her nymph and river children spread throughout the world, doing this in various ways. The misbehaving ones perhaps are not distributing the waters, so she calls on the lightning gods, the Cyclopes, to put them in line. Yet in this playful manner, Hermes comes acting as if he is the terrifying primordial thunder and lightning giants, causing them to bring their moisture. This tale, presented as comical, contains one of the strongest links between Hermes and an earlier function related to clouds. It also gives support to the idea that Arges, the Cyclops, is related to the name Argefontes. Like Apollo, Hermes may have originally been a slayer of these Cyclopes. Finally, we come to what is perhaps the most intriguing and misunderstood role of Hermes, his connection with the dead. Hermes leads the dead into the underworld, and occasionally out of it. Strictly, he goes only as far as Charon, who carries the dead across the river in his boat, but he is also named as the only messenger between Zeus and Hades. He leads Heracles into and out of the underworld, along with the Hound of Hell, Cerberus. He is invoked as Hermes the Chthonic in prayers to the dead, or other underworld gods, and in some local myths, he is worshipped alongside Demeter and Persephone. The role of Hermes in relation to these goddesses of soil and underworld is often thought to signify that he is an underworld god. However, it is as simple as the role which covers nearly all of his other myths, the god of pathways, bonds, and boundaries. To bring Persephone to the surface requires his aid, to guide the goddess, to bring her forth from the underworld to the surface like a seed bursting open and sprouting through the soil. That forceful act of transition and crossing boundaries requires Hermes, who controls the pathways between worlds. It also involves the fertile agent of rain, or water shed by the nymphs, with whom Hermes was closely connected. He is the escort of the soul because he is the guide, the master of the pathway between heaven, earth, and underworld, controlling the boundaries like a guardian, like the Hermae posted along the borders. Whereas Atlas is the pillar that separates and upholds heaven from beneath the seas, Hermes is the god of that pillar, connecting the heavens to the underworld. It is therefore incorrect to classify Hermes as a whole as a chthonic deity, though he has a chthonic duty. He traverses all realms, but is considered to be primarily heavenly. Thus, he is the herald of Zeus. He is called on in relation to the underworld and the dead because he is the one able to reach the underworld to deliver one's words and prayers to the spirits. His binding power also keeps the dead where they belong. By far, the most well-known son of Hermes is the god Pan, often depicted as being goat-like from the waist down. The Homeric hymn to Pan says that he was the son of the daughter of Dryopes, meaning oak-faced, possibly referring to a mountain abounding in oak trees, or just an oak tree itself. Pausanias records an oak grove that was sacred to Hermes. Other tales connect Dryopes to Apollo. Yet when the king migrated his people from Mount Oeta to the Peloponnese, they named their principal city Hermione, meaning Lady of Hermes. The Homeric hymn to Aphrodite also links Hermes to dryads. The story of Apollo's wooing of Dryopes even has him turn himself into a tortoise, one of the symbols of Hermes and Pan, showing that in particular regions these two gods had significant overlap, thus the confrontation in the Homeric hymn. Yet others say that Pan was the daughter of Penelope, and this woman was thought by some to be the wife of Odysseus. Given the time we spent on the connection between Odysseus and Hermes, such a view perhaps makes more sense than some give credit. Despite having little role in central mythology, Pan is recorded as having sanctuaries and altars dedicated to him widely, including at least 2 eternal flames. Mainalo, one of the tallest mountains in Arcadia, was sacred to Pan. He was a god of shepherds, of rustic music, of wild places, of packs of dogs, of hunting, and also prophecy. The tortoise was also sacred to him because of the lyre. At Mount Lycaon, where the famous Zeus Lycaon is honored with his mountain sanctuary, Pan was also worshipped as Pan Lycaos, the son of Zeus, and was either the divine twin of Argos with Callisto, or was fostered by him or with him. The dryad Erato, the wife of Argos, was the first prophetess of Pan. In some local myths, it was Pan who taught Apollo the art of prophecy, and Faunus, the Roman god equated with Pan, was also linked to prophecy, and was an ancient king of Latinum. Another Roman founding figure, Evander, was the son of Hermes, who brought the worship of Pan Lycaos and Hermes to Italy and instituted the festival of the Lupercalia. Some believe that in origin Pan and Hermes were the same god, with Pan having been another name, which eventually developed into a separate god interpreted as the son of Hermes. When we see that even the Homeric hymn to Hermes conflates the two in relation to the prophetic nymphs, it is plausible that Arcadian Pan Lycaos is the son of Zeus, yet is also connected to Evander, the son of Hermes. Lycaon was said to have built the first temple to Hermes, perhaps atop Mount Kylena, but a cult site of Pan associated with athletic games is upon the slope of Mount Lycaon. The wife of Lycaon is often Kylena, who appears to be a double of Maia. Pan is associated with many of the same things, including the lyre, prophecy, herding, and he likely had a wolf form. The origin of picturing him as a goat may even be intended to invoke this form because his other form was feared. It is possible that the Hermai, which represented one and the same god, eventually became viewed as separate by some people. By engaging in comparative analysis, we will be able to put this to the test. It has become fashionable to describe Hermes as being pre-Greek. Indeed, a new trend is emerging to try and ascribe nearly every element of Greek religion and culture to the mysterious pre-Greek origins. Yet, we have demonstrated that the name Hermes has an Indo-European origin. He likewise shares the greatest similarity with other Indo-European gods, so much so that it is unquestionable that he has an identical origin with them. 10 hymns in the Rig Veda are dedicated to the god Pushan. His name is derived from the theorized Indo-European name Peuson, from Indo-European pe, meaning to shepherd or protect. In Greek, this name becomes Pan, related to the same root as words like poimin, meaning a herdsman or shepherd, used as an epithet for Agamemnon, the shepherd of the people. The connotation is that the shepherd is the protector of the flock. Pushan is called Lord of the Path, and is asked to guide cattle and worshippers upon safe pathways, to guide them and guard them against wolves and other beasts, to drive away robbers and to protect the pastures, to destroy the double-headed one. Quote, "Him who we invoke for aid, who reigns supreme, the Lord of all that stands or moves, inspirer of the soul, that Pushan may promote the increase of our wealth, our keeper and our guard infallible for our good. Illustrious far and wide, may Indra prosper us, may Pushan prosper us, the master of all wealth. He is cloud-born, traveling the pathways far from heaven and far from earth, often called strong. He is the best charioteer, pulled by goats. He even guides the sun through the speckled clouds, and woos the maiden of the sun. He escorts the spirits of the dead to the abode of the ancestors, and leads the women to their husbands. He is deft of hand and mighty, standing beside Indra as he battles Vrtra, and together they milk the cloud cows, bedewing the pastures. Named a sage or seer, he is asked to protect against deceivers, and to soften or tear apart the hearts of the cheap man who withholds the means of life. He guides followers to treasures, is called Lord of all prosperity, and him who bears up heaven, all impelling. He is also invoked to aid in magic, and to give strength in combat, and asked not to send early heat, but to lead to meadows rich in grass. He is sought for food, and asked to feed the worshippers and invigorate. He, like Hermes, wields a golden sword, but also an awl and a cattle goad. In other words, he is associated with many of the functions of Hermes, and seemingly even have various corresponding myths. They are very closely related, but Hermes does have several features that are not ascribed to Pushan, but to other closely related gods. The Indo-Iranic god Mithra's name means one who binds. Persian Mithra lives upon the Hara Barazaiti, the central mountain which the sun, moon, and stars revolve around, a mountain similar to the nature of Atlas, with a name Hara, cognate with the root of the name Hermes. Mithra governs over contracts and oaths. In the Zoroastrian Yast, Mithra is repeatedly called Lord of wide pastures, said to grant wealth in cattle and to ensure waters. He is also repeatedly called sleepless and ever awake. Homer says the same of Hermes. In at least one case during Hellenistic Persia, Mithra was equated with Helios, Apollo, and Hermes. In the Rig Veda, Mitra and Varuna were associated with the pillars that sustain heaven and earth, and like the Persian Mithra, dwell in a mansion with 1,000 columns. Yet Hermes' staff, which puts to sleep and wakens, is also the very power of the god Savitar, who puts people to sleep and wakes them in the morning, associated with the rising and setting sun. Most likely is that Hermes did have a common origin with the god Pushan, who likewise in a very early period shared similar roles with other Indo-Iranian gods. The name Hermes developed from the Hermai, which marked the roads and boundaries that the god protected, and grew into a separate name and eventually a separate but closely connected god, so that it was thought Pan was his son. The god of the flocks, pastures, pathways, and boundaries likely was one of the most archaic Indo-European deities, as it directly relates to the life of the early Indo-Europeans who were primarily pastoral. The god had a solar connection embodying the pathways, movement, and energy of the sun, but is distinct from the sun and it seems to be related to the clouds, called cloud-born. The clouds were seen as the cattle in the sky that would have to be milked in order to rain down upon the pastures. If this analysis is correct, we would expect to find gods of a similar origin across Europe, and in fact, we do. In Gaul, many local epithets are attached to Mercury, who is one of the most revered gods. It is generally agreed that this figure seems to correspond to the god named in Gaelic myth as Lugh, in Gaulish as Lugus. He was associated with shoes and shoemaking, based on archaeology and some tales surviving in Welsh. And Hermes also, in the Homeric hymn, makes a pair of strange shoes. Lugh is skilled in every art. He takes the seat of the sage when he comes to Tara. He is the protector of the herds, the crops, and the trees, and drives off invaders from the borders. His mortal son is best known for holding off an entire army at a ford crossing, as they were trying to steal cattle. He is sometimes likened to the sun, yet clearly distinct from it. He must slay Balor of the Deadly Eye in order to free the cattle, whom he kills with a stone. Lugh is left behind from the initial invasion of Ireland because it was said that they wished to win without trickery. He is associated with prophecy, with boars, hounds, wolves, even lions. He oversees competitions. He was the first Fili, a class similar in ways to the ancient Greek herald. He originated festivals. He created games and horse racing. He is closely linked to the goddess of the land, hosting her funeral games. Most significantly, perhaps, when the houses are distributed by the Dagda, Lugh receives Rod Ruban, meaning the enduring road. Lugh trains under the master called Esros, meaning outlet or passage or way. And his son Cuchulainn was originally called Shitanta, meaning path residing. Then he was called by the name Cuchulainn for slaying a hound of the smith Culan, possibly cognate with Kylena. He vows to take the role of the hound, guarding the flocks, fields, and borders. Finally, Lugh's name may come from the word for oath. Herodotus said the Thracian nobles only swore oaths by Hermes. At the core, there is a relation to roads, pathways, borders, pastoral activities, things relating to binding, the killing of a giant related to the eye or eyes who steals a cow, to mastery of great skill. Though in Celtic tradition the god has a stronger militant aspect, they appear to stem from the same source, and even have myths that one could reconstruct as originally being the same. But what about Odin? Surely the king of the Norse gods couldn't in any way actually be linked to Hermes, or could he? During the time of his actual worship, Odin, or Woden, was equated to Mercury, and thus to Hermes. But why? In myths, as those preserved by Saxo Grammaticus, Odin appears to ancient kings giving advice, telling them what they should do to achieve victory, teaching them, guiding them. He is likened to the sun even, when he returns to drive off those who had usurped his kingdom in his absence. And at Ragnarok, he will wear a shining golden helmet into battle. He is a great wise man and seeker of knowledge, with numerous spells that will help a man. The world tree is called Yggdrasil, meaning Odin's horse. This is taken as poetic, meaning the place where Odin hung himself in sacrifice, himself to himself. That may be, but the world tree is the connection point between all worlds. Like Atlas of Norse myth, he travels to the underworld to consult the dead. Like Hermes and Odysseus, Odin is likewise associated with memory, prophecy, wild animals like wolves and bears. He is called the Journey Empowerer, god of cargo, the Wanderer, the Yeller, something closely associated with Pan, Fetterer, Fetter Loosener, Teacher of Gods, Wayfarer, God of Riders, Sleep bringer and awakener. It is possible that the two wolves of Odin are also those who chase the sun and moon, causing their daily cycle. His main enemy is the wolf who will consume him, like the wolves that will consume the sun and moon. Now there is a lot in the nature of Odin, and in Lugh for that matter, that is not like Hermes in terms of his role in overall myth. That is in fact much more akin to the high nature of Zeus as being lord of the cosmic law. But again, we find many cognate abilities and functions that are specific to this god that can hardly be accidental. Roads, guiding, sound, memory, binding, trade, sleep and alertness, the wolf, the bear, even sacrifice. No other Greek god is depicted making a sacrifice, and Hermes sacrifices to himself as well as the other gods. Both Odin and Lugh also seem to share a myth where they die upon a tree, and we saw that many myths associated with early kings involved those kings dying and being resurrected, and that they were closely connected to Hermes. Hermes and Odin even dress in similar fashion, having a fancy for wide-brimmed hats. While acknowledging that Odin was interpreted as Hermes or Mercury during the Roman period, people, including myself, have tried to find numerous ways to explain this away. However, having gained a better understanding of the origin and role of Hermes, not only does it appear that Celtic and Germanic peoples were correct to equate these gods, but that they very likely developed out of the same set of ideas. Several founding figures in Roman myth are likewise associated with Hermes or Pan, such as Evander and Faunus. But how is a god of the heralds or seers, a god of paths and a herdsman, how does he become a king? Hermes is the herald because he is the lord of the connections and the guide, but the herald of the unseen king becomes the king himself. Thor is no Zeus, though he is the thunder god. Hermes, as the representative of the cosmic Zeus, makes the god's will known to man. Seldom is Zeus depicted connected with men directly. If he desires to, then it is often that Hermes goes in his place. He brings the gods to men and guides men to follow the will of heaven. Zeus, in his most elevated state, is the overmind ruling the laws of the cosmos, but he plays a dual role as the storm god. But what if this wasn't the case? What if Hermes was the herald of this remote, almost unfathomable deity of the cosmic order? This role of herald then becomes quite different. He becomes the only one able to interpret and guide one according to the cosmic mind which only he knows. He rules over the connections between heaven, earth, and underworld, represented by Atlas, or the world tree. In this way, Hermes obtains a kind of Christ-like role, and that wasn't lost on early Christians, who depicted Jesus like Hermes, calling him the Good Shepherd. Whether it is guiding cattle to market or pasture, leading hunters through dense woods, or leading one onward toward knowledge, leading one to Hades or to Olympus. A great number of the concepts around Hermes involve paths and guiding one along those paths. His most important animal, the ram, is most famous for finding such pathways along the sides of steep mountains. Hermes is, among other things, the guide, the god of pathways, both cosmic and within one's daily life, and in death. Well, I hope you found this video interesting, and if you did, you'll consider supporting my work through Patreon or PayPal. Videos like this require extensive research and time to put together, and I couldn't do it without all of my wonderful Patreon and PayPal supporters, and I thank them greatly. Best wishes to you listening, and as always, stand tall.